A former FBI agent is admitting that left wing protesters are often targeted way more than right wing groups. In fact, right wing groups are essentially given a pass, while the government and law enforcement literally creates lists of protesters or even people who might be linked to protests or even sympathetic to protests and pass those lists around amongst each other. So now these lists, of course, are filled with very, very personal information, as I'm going to get to in detail in this story. So now this list is, again, this is detailing mainly with what's been going on in Wisconsin. And so you had a lot of Black Lives Matter protests in Wisconsin, specifically the one in Kenosha. So now, according to documents recently obtained by the Wisconsin Examiner, one of these lists was shared with members of several different police departments as well as the FBI, despite the fact, of course, that the police departments, in this case the Kenosha Police Department, denied its existence. From the report, although its creation date remains unclear, this list was used as early as mid-July last year. Protests in Milwaukee began around May 29th following the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police on May 25th. Wauwatosa's protests didn't begin until early June. Originally created by Dominic Rutkowski, a crime analyst for the Wauwatosa Police Department, the list was shared with numerous local and federal agencies throughout southeastern Wisconsin. Officially, the WPD acknowledged that it was shared with the Milwaukee Police Department and the FBI, but it turns out, according to internal emails, that list was shared among many other more departments. So now, in fact, this list, according to emails, Radikowski referred to this as a target list. It's a target list. Now, I'm going to explain who those targets are and why they're considered to be targets. But so now, since the list was released earlier this year, the WPD has shied away from calling it a protester list. Spokespeople stated the list includes potential witnesses, victims, or suspects that were involved with protesting or the activities surrounding protests last summer. Except that, of course, when you look at the list, you discover that people that have even represented people killed by the police, along with protesters and others and politicians who never were at the protests, were still on this list. For example, attorney Kimberly Motley and Deja Vishny. So those pair have actually represented the families of people killed by former Wauwatosa officer Joseph Mensah in officer-involved shootings, and even includes a Wisconsin Examiner journalist. Now, it also includes a list of the Milwaukee area activist community across numerous organizations and elected officials. In fact, the earliest known emails discussed in the list actually predate Mensah being suspended with pay following public pressure after, of course, one of the officer-involved shooting. This was one of the first results of Wauwatosa's protests, which were motivated by a trio of shootings involving Mensah from 2015 to 2020. Mensah ended up resigning from the WPD in late 2020, but don't worry, he now works as a detective at the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department. So, resigns after pressure from shooting people, and then just goes to work at another police department. Great. Fantastic. And this is what happens. Now, overall, intel on over 200 different people is documented in this list, from names to notes about criminal records, places protesters use for meetings, social media accounts, their car makes and models, addresses, phone numbers, pictures. It's a massive list, and it gets worse. Because it turns out that most of the people on this list, according to TMJ4, 3/4 of them never been charged with a misdemeanor or a felony at all. And yet, this has been referred to as a target list. Why were they targeted? Because they had the audacity to defend Black lives. And of course, when caught, the police departments sharing this list around completely deny it. In fact, the Minneapolis Police Department, would also had the list shared with them, said that we do not keep a database of those who participate in protests, adding the department strongly encourages people to exercise their First Amendment rights lawfully. And of course, you go through every police department, and they say essentially the same thing. We respect people's right to protest. Well, not when it comes to left-wing protests. The Washington Examiner also recently received an email from the KPD via an open records request that shows the department had received the list in mid-September after unrest over the shooting of Jacob Blake subsided and the armed right-wing groups disappeared from the city. Rutkowski shared the list with Matthew Gibson, a Milwaukee DA investigator. Gibson had retired from the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office earlier this year, but on August 28, Gibson asked for any list or photographs of protesters to share with Kenosha. On September 15th, the list, which had been shared by Rutkowski, was sent to Kenosha PD Detective Pablo Torres, who worked for the department's Special Investigations Unit. The Gibson's email reads, "Here's an updated list of the subjects identified as members or associates of something called the People's Revolution." So what is the People's Revolution? They are a group of protesters who demonstrated throughout southeastern Wisconsin for over 400 consecutive days following George Floyd's death. So they're a group that protested. They protested peacefully, but were called the People's Revolution. And immediately, cops are like, "We got to get those people. Get them. We need to track them." They're called the People's Revolution. They must be communists. Now, several law enforcement personnel were also CC'd in Gibson's email, including an FBI agent. The group, shortened to TPR, is mentioned throughout that email chain. Now, last August, however, the WPD denied targeting any specific groups, even though they targeted the People's Revolution. And again, the KPD also denied having a list or sharing it, despite being caught red-handed passing the list along. So this is the problem, okay? You have law enforcement profiling left-wing activists who are, again, primarily peaceful. 96% of the George Floyd protests were 100% peaceful. Yet, armed militias, by the way, they turned out to many protests. And, oh, look at that. Some situations ended with violence. Weird how that works out. Very, very strange, right? It turns out when when you show up to protests with guns, violence happens. Very strange. Now, the militias, as pointed out, were welcomed by the police, by law enforcement. They weren't being tracked like the People's Revolution. They weren't being tracked by like journalists for the Washington Examiner. No. I'm sorry, Wisconsin Examiner. They were not being tracked because they're right-wingers and they love the right wing. So now, here's where we get to the FBI official, the former FBI official that basically is like, yeah, this is incredibly disturbing. This is Michael German, a former FBI agent of 16 years and a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University Law School. He says, this is terrible, this is incredibly disturbing that they are profiling and collecting all of this information on, protesters for racial justice, anti-racist protesters, while allowing the right wing, who has been incredibly violent, to basically go scot-free. And in fact, be supported by police. Now, German viewed FBI documents obtained by the Wisconsin Examiner via Freedom Information Act requests and the records date to early August 2020 and described how the FBI itself had utilized and received the list following an incident outside the home of former Officer Mensa. So there was a protest outside Mensa's house that ended up in a confrontation. Somebody had fired a gun up in the air. The crowd scattered. And there were different accounts of what happened. The WPD stated one shot was fired, but Mensa posted that several shots were fired. That investigation into the incident led to the arrest of several different protesters. 3 men later faced charges, including battery to a law enforcement officer, harboring a felon, party to a crime, and second-degree reckless endangering safety. Now, the FBI documents state that 2 days after said incident, Milwaukee PD shared the protester list with the FBI's Milwaukee office. The documents state that the Bureau received the list of individuals that may have been involved in the August 8th, 2020 events at that home. The names and dates and births were searched and redacted and through open source methods for potential nexus terrorism cases. So now you're terrorists. Wow. Okay. Now, a section also read, the information herein has been determined by the FBI to be pertinent to and within the scope of an authorized law enforcement activity and should be considered in the context of the assessment or predicted investigation of which the information relates. Now, the list itself, however, predates the incident by at least several weeks. Additionally, the documents indicated that all the names on it were checked and placed into an official FBI file, regardless of whether the names were of people present during the incident or not. Some of those people on the list that are now in an official FBI file related to this incident weren't even there, weren't even protesters at all. And in fact, one of these people includes a mayor. Now, German told the Examiner, quote, this isn't something that belongs in an FBI file because this is taking specific individuals who are identified for being at a protest and implying that they're involved in some kind of criminal activity, and that can have long-lasting ramifications when there was no justification for collecting the list in the first place, or nothing apparent in the documents at least. Now, as I mentioned, there was even a mayor that was involved. In early September of 2020, WPD detectives helping lead the Mensa investigation labeled Wauwatosa's mayor and others as quote-unquote higher value targets for the department. This included Mayor Dennis McBride, who was labeled a target to the investigation due to his perceived support for BLM. Following an internal investigation to the HTV PowerPoint this year, the Detective Joseph Lewandowski was disciplined for creating it. Lewandowski was then promoted to sergeant and moved out of the investigative division, and now is associated with the WPD's Special Operations Group. So, oh, look at that. Now, he had authored other reports about the mayor's quote-unquote questionable conduct during the protests. The Wisconsin Examiner has also recently obtained warrants authored by the WPD that sought social media information for several protesters following the incident at Mensa's home back in August. Those warrants included everything from private messages to geographic information dating back to May 25th, the day Floyd died in Minneapolis. Protests in Milwaukee did not begin until 4 days after Floyd's death. Very, very shady. Very shady indeed. So now, by the way, here's what the FBI said about this. The WPD provided a list to FBI Milwaukee of individuals assessed to be present during various incidents of violent activity in their city. This information was shared by FBI to WPD, not requested by the FBI. And any names checked by the FBI were checked for an authorized investigative purpose. Now, the FBI did not answer direct questions regarding whether journalists or lawyers on that list were targeted with electronic surveillance. So, but understand, like, this is a large group of law enforcement, different agencies, different police departments, all working together, all sharing lists of people that may or may not be been involved with Black Lives Matter protests, or even being sympathetic to Black Lives Matter. Which, as I keep reminding you, the protests overwhelmingly peaceful. But right-wing groups who often come to protests armed and end up getting into conflicts with others, well, they're not treated the same way. In fact, as I mentioned, they're welcomed. in Kenosha. We saw that. They're not arrested. They're not tear gassed. They're not told to go home. In fact, they're told, we appreciate you. And then are given water bottles. And thanks. As I mentioned, Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse was, hey, we appreciate what you're doing here. We appreciate it. Thanks. Even though he was 17 at the time and was not legally allowed to carry an AR-15 rifle. Cops didn't care. He even apparently tried to surrender. Cops were like, no. That's after he shot and killed 2 people and wounded another. In fact, an FBI surveillance plane had flown over the city while teams of marshals operated arrests and quick response teams on the ground in Kenosha that night. Officers closely monitored Black Lives Matter protesters through social media, even along their highway journeys to Kenosha. The People's Revolution is also referenced among text messages sent and received by former Kenosha PD Chief Daniel Miskinis after the Rittenhouse shooting. That night, the night of the shooting, officers in dispatch also communicated about receiving calls about armed white ring groups slashing the tires of BLM protesters. Half an hour later, Rittenhouse would fatally shoot 2 people and wound another. The only deaths that were reported that night. But again, this isn't just Wisconsin. This is also happening everywhere in the country. One example of law enforcement favoring the right and ignoring threats of violence from the right was January 6th. The FBI and Homeland Security did not produce threat intelligence reports leading up to the insurrection in D.C. While Wisconsin's protester list focused on left-wing activism and Black Lives Matter, there has been no similar list produced of right-wing protests or the Make America Great Again rallies, which had occurred in Wauwatosa last year. Why? Because they agree. They agree with the right wing. Law enforcement, unfortunately, always does. Many of these rioters understand we're former law enforcement or military. Now, for German, he says that the protester list kind of relates to the events of January 6th, and says that the handling of that list certainly contradicts the FBI's post-January 6th claims about its perceived limits on its ability to monitor social media. Here they're saying all this public violence by far-right militant groups that they ignored, all the myriad ways people warned the FBI, including members of Congress, former Justice Department officials, especially calling the FBI to warn them about this. The FBI claims that it's because they somehow didn't have the authority to monitor social media, which is actually false when you look at their publicly available regulations. But here, clearly that the FBI would try to scrutinize protesters' social media to find some link to something they call a domestic violent extremists raises all kinds of questions. So again, the FBI lied, law enforcement lied, when they said, well, we can't look into social media, because they had been looking into left-wing protesters' social media all along. But we can't do so when it comes to the right wing. Because of course, they agree with the far right. They're on the same team. Yes, police hate anti-racism protests. Why? Because they're often the ones perpetuating a racist system. That's why. They're never concerned with violent right-wingers. And by the way, I'm not saying that every right-winger in this country is violent. That'd be ridiculous. But obviously, we know that right now, right-wingers, anti-government groups, members of the far right, are the biggest source of terrorism in the United States. It is not the left. It is not Antifa. It is not BLM. And by the way, it's right-wingers, these sovereign citizens that have been murdering police officers. But no, let's pay attention to the left. And even, by the way, if the cops aren't racist, they still hold up the racist institution of policing. After all, police are what? They're descended from slave patrols. And groups like the FBI are well known for going after civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., whom they urged to off himself. So this should not be a surprise. Not at all. Not at all. And by the way, again, the same stuff that they did before, they are still doing now. We have a major problem with the violent right wing in this country being given a pass by law enforcement as the law enforcement continues to scrutinize the left and go after journalists, professors, protesters, etc. This is a huge problem. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share with your friends. You can subscribe and help out the channel by becoming a patron. It's patreon.com/Jeff Waldorf, or you can become a channel member as well by hitting the join button below.